Everybody. So, we said we begin with the lung. So the first step, you have your lung. From your lung, what kind of blood do we have returning to the heart? From the lung to the heart. What kind of blood? Red blood or blue blood?
Going away or coming?
Going away from the lung.
Red.
So say no more. Away from the lung, that is red blood, oxygen rich. So red blood, it has plus oxygen, oxygen for oxidative phosphorylation, oxygen for aerobic respiration, and it is full of nutrients. Nutrients. What are examples of nutrients? These are your carbohydrates, your fats, your proteins, and who's carrying this oxygen? These are blood vessels, blood conduits, blood vessels, blood conduits, and they carry that to the left atria. They carry that to the left atria. So the left atria, so that's step number one. Good blood leaves the lung heading to the left atria. Then the left atria will receive, that's step number two, will receive good blood, and between the left atria and the left ventricle is a bicuspid valve. It has two cusps, cusp number one, cusp number two, and this is known as your bicuspid valve. That's your bicuspid valve. Okay, and it is between the left atria and the left ventricle. Left ventricle. So blood is now left the lungs and entered the left atria. That's step number two. Step number three, went through the bicuspid valve. That's step number three. Then it settled in the left ventricle. That is step number four. And from the left ventricle, the left ventricle is going to pump the blood out through blood vessels, blood conduits, blood vessels, away from the heart. So since the blood is going away from the heart, these are arteries. These are arteries, and they carry red blood, oxygenated blood, blood that is full of nutrients. And what is this called? This is your aorta. That is your aorta. And then we reach the tissue. So in the tissue, that is your tissue. That's your tissue. So when you come to your tissue, you're going to have a capillary microcirculation where you will have an exchange between red blood and blue blood. So these are holes. Through these holes, coming out to the tissue are the good stuff. Your oxygen is going to come out to the tissue. Oxygen is coming out to the tissue. Nutrients are coming out to the tissue. And the tissue will use them, and all of the carbon dioxide, all of the metabolic waste is going to return back into the venous side. So this is the venous side of the capillary microcirculation, and this is the arteriolar side. And then the bad blood now is going to return to the right, excellent, right atria, and then between the right atria and the right ventricle is a tricuspid valve, and then we would have our right ventricle, and our right ventricle is going to contract to pump this bad blood back into the lung, back into the lungs. Back into the lungs. Okay, so let's go over the steps again. Oxygenated blood, rich in oxygen, rich in nutrients. Step number 1 is going to be carried by blood vessels, and these blood vessels are heading to the heart. So that makes them veins. And since they are coming from the lung, these are pulmonary veins. These are pulmonary veins. These are pulmonary veins. So pulmonary veins are conduits and blood vessels that bring oxygenated blood from the lung to the left atria. Then the left atria would squeeze to allow for the blood to flow through the bicuspid valve, and the bicuspid valve is going to allow the blood to go into the left ventricle, and then the left ventricle is going to squeeze, and there is a valve here between your left ventricle and your aorta, and that is known as the aortic valve. That allows this oxygenated blood to go out through the aorta. Then the aorta is going to bring oxygenated blood and nutrients to the tissue. And then the tissue is going to use that oxygen for oxidative phosphorylation, and for aerobic respiration. Oxygen is very important because oxygen is the terminal and final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain in your mitochondria. Then all the metabolic waste that is going to be generated, all the buildup of the metabolic waste is going to be sent back into the venous side of the circulation. And we're going to have all of this deoxygenated blood sent away from the tissue toward the heart. So now we're heading to the heart, then that's definitely a vein. And since it's going from the system to the heart, that's a systemic vein. And the artery that was bringing good blood to the tissue system, that is known as a systemic artery. An example of that is the aorta. Then the systemic vein is going to bring deoxygenated blood into the right atria. Right atria is going to send deoxygenated blood through the tricuspid valve. Then the blood is going to flow to the right ventricle. Then between the right ventricle and this vessel is another valve here, and this valve is known as the pulmonary valve. And these blood vessels carrying deoxygenated blood away from the heart, so that makes them arteries because they carry blood away from the heart. These are arteries. And what kind of arteries are those? These are arteries, and they are going to the lungs, so they are pulmonary arteries. Then the bad blood is going to enter into the lung and it's going to get refreshed and it's going to get perfusion and the carbon dioxide will be removed and you'll have your oxygen. So you got to know this cycle. Oxygen carried through your blood vessels. These are going away from the lung, so they are pulmonary, and these are pulmonary heading to the heart, pulmonary veins. They enter the left atria, and from the left atria, they go through the bicuspid valve, the step number 3. Step number 4, they go into the left ventricle, and the left ventricle would contract, sending blood away through this aortic valve, and then the blood is going to flow through the aorta into your tissue, and from the tissue an exchange will happen. The tissue in your body will take oxygen, return carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is going to be sent back through systemic veins, and systemic veins are going to bring bad blood into the right atria. Right atria will send the bad blood through the valves known as your atrioventricular valve. This is your tricuspid valve. This is your tricuspid valve. And the right ventricle is going to send blood out through the pulmonary valve to the pulmonary artery, bringing it back into the lung. You also have to remember that both of these valves between the left atria and the left ventricle, these are known as atrioventricular valves. Atrioventricular valves. And the valves between the ventricle and the outside of the body, like here and like here, these are known as semilunar valves. 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 Are we clear? Are we clear? Okay, so the more you do this, the more you're going to get it. This is not a thing where you're going to get it one time. You have to repeat it. So the lungs are going to send oxygenated blood away from the lung, so that's pulmonary, to the heart, that's veins. So these are pulmonary veins. Pulmonary veins are going to dump their good blood into the left atria. The left atria are going to contract and send their good blood through the bicuspid valve, and then the good blood is going to go into the left ventricle. Left ventricle is going to contract and eject blood through these semilunar valves, and this one in particular is known as the aortic semilunar valve. And then you're going to have the blood going into the aorta, and from the aorta you're going to have an exchange happening at the capillary microcirculation where oxygen and nutrients are going to come out, and then carbon dioxide, metabolic waste are going to return into the vein, the blue side, and then systemic veins are going to return from the system, the tissue system, into the right atria. So these are your vena cavas. These are your vena cava. Your vena cava, you have two sets. You have superior vena cava and you have inferior vena cava. Superior vena cava. What are the superior vena cavas? Oh no, my red chalk. No. The superior vena cava. These are bringing, so if you are a vein, if you are a vena cava, you're bringing bad blood. Where are you bringing the bad blood from? That's the question. If you're bringing bad blood from the upper extremities, like your brain, your head, from your neck, that's the superior vena cava, because it brings it from the superior part of your body. But if you are draining bad blood from the inferior part of your body, then that is known as the inferior vena cava, like your abdomen and your thighs, the skeletal muscles of your calf and the soles of your feet. That's your inferior vena cava, bringing bad blood from there. And then the inferior vena cava are going to bring bad blood into the right atria. Right atria will contract, opening these tricuspid valves, and then the blood is going to flow through the right ventricle. Right ventricle is going to contract, opening up the pulmonary valve, and then from the pulmonary valve, all the blood is going to return into the lung again. So this circle, anything I mentioned in this circle, you have to know it. To know it very well. So now if I look at one of my models, please look at one of the models. If I look at this, what do I have? Obviously, if you want to recognize the structures, you begin very big. The planet. What planet are we on? Then the continent. Then the country. Then the state. Then the borough. Then the address. So this is not a kidney. This is not a brain. That is the heart. Then you begin with the biggest. What is the first big thing in the heart? Are your chambers. You have 2 ventricles and 2 atria. How do you tell the left from right? The biggest ventricle is your left ventricle. That's your left ventricle. Did everybody label? Did you find your left ventricle? Please find your left ventricle. Please find your, so that is my, okay, so if I look now, okay, so if this is my heart, this is my heart. Okay, if I open up my heart and I look inside, what do I see? I see chambers. How many chambers do I see? I see 4. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Which are the bottom and what are the top? The bottom ones are your ventricles. Did everybody find the ventricles? Okay. Now everybody move on to the top. Did you find the 2 big chambers? The atria. Did you find your atria? Now, are you able to find the left ventricle from the right ventricle? Can you discriminate the left ventricle from the right ventricle? So the biggest one is your left ventricle. Excellent. The biggest one is your left ventricle. The second biggest bottom chamber is your right ventricle. Have you been able to find your right ventricle? That's your right ventricle. Then on top you have your 2 atria. Which one is the left atria? Obviously is the one that's on the top of the left ventricle. Which one is the right atria? This one is at the top of the right ventricle. Excellent. Between them, what do you see between them? Is a gate, is a door. Right here, these are your atrioventricular. So on the exam, if I ask you, what's the name of this valve right here? And you say atrioventricular valve. That's a 3rd credit, not even half credit. Because we have 2 atrioventricular valves. And if you say that's the left atrioventricular valve, that's 0.6. But if you want to get the full point, you say the bicuspid valve. Because the bicuspid valve is your left atrioventricular valve. If I point to the right one, you say it's between the right atria and the right ventricle. It's an atrioventricular valve because it's between a right and a left, between a atria and a ventricle. It's on the right, so it's a right atrioventricular valve, and it is your tricuspid valve. Tricuspid valve. This is your tricuspid valve.
So where's the aorta valve?
We're going to get to that. Let's now go step by step. Did everybody find? Please find your 2 atrioventricular valves. Have you found them? Yeah. But don't look at it as the gummy thing. Look at it as it is between 2 bottom chamber, up chamber, bottom chamber, top chamber. If it's on the left, that's your left atrioventricular valve. On the right, that's your right atrioventricular valve.
Yeah, this one also is there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's atrioventricular valve.
That's
Okay, so the right atrioventricular valve, what is it called? Tricuspid valve. The left atrioventricular valve is called the bicuspid valve. Okay, then this valve, this valve, what holds it in place? What staples it? What holds it in place from falling apart? You see this parachute? Can you see the parachute-like structure? That's the tendon. What is it called? It's called chorda tendinae. It is called chorda tendinae. The chorda tendinae. This chorda tendinae is the parachute-like structure holding the valve in place, preventing the valve from prolapsing. Preventing the valve from prolapsing and falling and collapsing. So why do we not want the valve to collapse? Because if the valve collapses, you're going to have blood leaking from one chamber into the other. So if this valve is defected, when the ventricles contract, some blood is going to flow back into the atria. Some blood is going to return and reflux. So when this blood, yes?
In this case, like just like this one?
Yeah, so if that valve is defected, that means, so what is the initial job of the atrioventricular valve? They are like doors. They open, allowing blood to flow down from the atria to the ventricle. But when they are defected, when ventricles contract, blood is now going to flow up right back. So when the blood floods right back into the atria, next time when the atria contract, they're going to squeeze more blood than before or less blood? They had blood. They pump blood, but some of it reflects back into the atria. It's not supposed to, because remember, the atrioventricular valves are supposed to be one-sided, one way, from the atria into the ventricle, from the atria into the ventricle. But because they collapse, they prolapse, they are leaking. So the next time the ventricles contract, some blood is going to leak right back into the ventricle, into the atria. It's not supposed to, it's supposed to be closed, but it's damaged. The parachute is not working. It's defected. So the blood is going to flow right back into the atria. So next time when your atria contract, with the amount of blood that they are bringing into the ventricle, are they bringing into the ventricle more blood or less blood? More blood, because the blood that they are pumping in plus the one that reflux from the previous cycle. Remember we said the valve is defected, right? So it's going to allow some blood to leak back.
The body wouldn't compensate for that, knowing that there's already blood there, so it just pump less and generate?
It cannot, because it's a cycle. So the blood leaks back and then you pump again, so now even more blood comes back to the heart. So now the heart muscle has to deal with this extra amount of blood it has to pump. It has to adapt to that. It has to compensate for that. So how does it do that? When you go to the gym and you lift your dumbbells, what's gonna happen to the bicep? They're gonna get bigger. So the heart muscle, because it's gonna have to accommodate to more blood pumping due to the blood that has reflux, it's gonna get thicker. The heart muscle is gonna get thicker and bigger, and then the heart size is gonna increase. And when that patient who has a defected heart valve, when they take an x-ray, their heart is gonna become big in size, known as cardiomegaly, really big, really thick hearted size, due to the defect in this valve. So this valve is very important, and it's hooked by these types of tendons known as the chorda tendinae. And the chorda tendinae, you see these chorda tendinae are attached to the bottom. They are attached to the bottom of the ventricles. They are attached to the bottom of the ventricles through papillary muscles. Through papillary muscles. Through papillary muscles. So the papillary muscles hook your chorda tendinae to your heart. Yes? So the mitral valve is the same thing as your bicuspid valve. That's the mitral valve.
So it's
The same thing. Yeah, that's the nickname. That's the nickname of the bicuspid valve. Because you know, in the church, the mitrals used to wear a hat that has two sides, something like that. So they used to call it the mitral valve. That's why. Now they don't wear that no more. Okay, so now please hold your models and start investigating. So you have to know your chordae tendineae, your papillary muscles, and all this circulation. So when you have this circulation in mind, you're able now to tell. If you have this circulation and this concept in mind, you can now tell who is who. So